So, liebe Gäste, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ein ganz herzliches Willkommen im KörberForum. Zurück auf der Weltbühne sollten wir Russland fürchten. Das ist das Thema unseres heutigen Abends. Und Russland ist tatsächlich schon seit Jahren aus den Nachrichten nicht mehr wegzudenken. Für die einen ist Russland der furchteinflößende Nachbar im Osten, für die anderen ist Russland ein Partner und ein selbstverständlicher Teil Europas. Wir als Stiftung haben das Thema Russland in Europa besonders in den Fokus unserer Aktivitäten gestellt. Ich freue mich daher sehr, heute einen Gast aus Moskau zur Buchvorstellung hier begrüßen zu dürfen. Ein ganz herzliches Willkommen an Dmitri Trenin in Hamburg. Dmitri Trenin ist Gründungsmitglied und Direktor des Carnegie Moscow Centers, ein renommierter internationaler Think Tank, und er ist einer der führenden außen- und sicherheitspolitischen Experten Russlands. Mit einer spannenden Biografie. Trenin diente von 1972 bis 1933 bei der sowjetischen und dann der russischen Armee. Und sie waren unter anderem auch in Potsdam stationiert und der erste russische Offizier, der im NATO Defense College in Rom gelehrt hat. In seinem neu erschienenen Buch stellt er nicht nur die Frage, ob wir Russland fürchten sollten, sondern er macht auch ganz konkrete Vorschläge, wie wir mit Russland umgehen sollen. Mein Name ist Liana Fix, ich werde die Diskussion heute moderieren. Sie wird auch im Livestream übertragen. Sie können also auch Ihre Fragen unter dem Hashtag KörberForum online stellen. Wir werden sie aufnehmen und natürlich können Sie später auch direkt an Herrn Trenin Fragen stellen. Ich würde Sie nun bitten, die Kopfhörer aufzusetzen, weil die Veranstaltung auf Englisch stattfinden wird. So, I now switch to English, Dmitri, although you speak excellent German and understand German very well. But thank you once again for launching your book with us today. You just arrived from Moscow yesterday, where you live just within a couple of miles from the Kremlin, which is indeed the source of concern or even fear for many people. And in your book, you pledge to give an honest insider answer to the question, should we fear Russia? I'm sure many also within this audience would say, you know, Russia is a nuclear power, they have an unpredictable foreign policy behavior, an autocratic leadership, so what is not to fear about Russia? And yet you say that some of these fears are dated and groundless that we have. So my first question to you would be, Dmitri, what fears should we have and what fears towards Russia are groundless?
Zuerst bedanke ich mich ganz herzlich für diese Einladung. Es ist eine große Ehre für mich. Und das Thema ist äußerst wichtig, meiner Meinung nach. Und die Zeit ist auch richtig, dieses Thema zu besprechen. Aber ich bitte um Verzeihung. Als ich Deutsch spreche, muss ich denken. Als ich Englisch spreche, muss ich nicht. Weiter geht's auf Englisch. So thank you very much, Liana, for this invitation. And I thank the Körber-Stiftung for having brought me and my wife Vera to the wonderful city of Hamburg. It's truly very important to deal with the topic that you have designed for this meeting. My book is just a pretext for talking about that, and the good thing about the book is that it's short. So if anyone has a couple of hours of time, it doesn't take you more than that. It's 110 pages, very, very short. It's truly an important question in a very important period of time. I was asked to talk about fear, the fear of Russia in the West. I was asked whether we should fear Russia. I said, well, maybe I should write about should the West fear Russia. No, they told me you have to to use the we. So I was in a very strange position as a Russian person talking about should we fear Russia. But the short answer to the question is not that one should not fear. I think fear is essentially a very destimulating thing. It's a paralyzing sentiment, not something that I would advise people to have. But instead of saying you shouldn't fear, which you would probably consider to be naive, and I will not use it, I will say you need to handle Russia with care. You don't have to fear it, but handle it with care. And that's my first point. My second point is as follows. In this day and age, a lot of people talk about a new Cold War. And as somebody, as Liana has just said, who has taken part in the first Cold War, I see an enormous difference. And I would not use the historical analogy. Because if you accept the analogy that this is a second coming of what we lived through in the past, you will be looking for things that will not happen. And you will be missing the things that will. It's a very different environment. In that old Cold War, the only Cold War, I don't think you can have a repeat of that because the circumstances are so different. We wouldn't be holding this conference. I wouldn't be traveling here. You wouldn't have the opportunity. It's different because there's a vast asymmetry between the parties. In the Cold War, you had two political military blocs on a global basis, essentially fighting over or competing very hard over dominance in the world. Today, you don't have that. You have the United States on the one hand, the dominant power in today's world, and you have a Russia which is far inferior in stature, in status, in power than was the Soviet Union. You don't have the ideological divide that we used to have. That Cold War was very much about which system, whether it's democracy or communism, that offered a better future for humanity, and you don't have that today. In the Cold War, there was something like very crude respect for the other side. You don't have it today. I don't know which is worse, when the Western mainstream media routinely demonize Mr. Putin, or when the Russian state-run media routinely lampoon Western leaders. I don't know which is worse. I think both are pretty bad. Even more dangerous is the situation in which we basically have no mutually accepted rules. In the Cold War, those rules were unwritten, but they were nonetheless very much respected. A non-respect of the rules carried an enormous penalty, and no one was prepared, on either side was prepared to pay that penalty. So there were some rules. Today, I don't think that they exist. We can talk about legality, we can talk about the breaking of rules, rules are being broken, no question about that. And the problem is that we don't have mutually acceptable rules, which makes the situation pretty unpredictable and pretty dangerous. And lastly, it's not lastly, but I don't want to go through the whole list, but let's just focus on a few things. Lastly, on my list, I would say that the responsibility that was felt by not just the leaders, but the elites in the days of the Cold War, and which was based on the awareness of the shadow of a nuclear war under which we all lived, and this country more than any other, is no longer there. The shadow is gone. It's somewhere almost over the horizon for a lot of people, which is very interesting because the nukes are still where they are, quite enough of them. And they're still pretty ready. And they're still targeted on the same targets as before, for the most part. But this responsibility that existed in the days of the Cold War is gone. And that, I think, is very destabilizing. In other words, let's say if you compare the Cold War with the situation today, I would say today is sometimes could be more dangerous than the Cold War, but it's different. It's dangerous in new ways. And this is what I'm trying to describe in the book. So if it's not the Cold War, what is it? Well, I have not been able to come up with any smart term for that. And I just reached for the word that would most adequately describe the current situation, and I came up with the word confrontation. The Cold War was also confrontation, but it was a confrontation of a certain type. And it was global, and it was the most important thing that was going on in the world for 40-plus years. Today is a confrontation between the all-important, the all-powerful the United States of America and Russia, which is essentially insisting on being taken seriously by the United States and is trying to define its security interests, and is defying its security interests, the way it sees its leadership, sees those interests. And that comes into clash with, comes into some kind of a conflict with certainly the United States. But this confrontation, let me put it this way, is not something accidental. It's not that we simply, it's not a road accident. It's not that we simply, didn't take the right turn and we collided. I think it's fundamental, and I think it's about the world order. I think it's part of the larger issue of the changing world order. Of course, Russia is not the principal challenger. The principal challenger sits in Asia, and its name is China. But China is operating on a very different basis. It has a very different strategic culture, and it has very different strategizing. And it's not competing with the United States the way that other potential challengers or real challengers to global primacy did in the past. Russia is a very strange case because you have a power that a lot of people thought was finished as a great power. Just 20 years ago, there was a near consensus among my colleagues, and certainly in the United States by the turn of the century, that Russia is a has-been power. It's spent force. It's yesterday's snow or last winter's snow. It's very rare for a former challenger / hegemon of half the world to come back within a generation and try to do something. So what Russia is doing is a bit strange, but to a lot of people, I think, certainly in the United States. But to Russia, it's a fight for two things. It's a fight for its own version of the global order, or the world order, I think would be more correct to say, in which hegemony should be replaced by some kind of an oligarchy. Russia is not a country that is devoted to the principle of in real terms of a democratic order. I don't know what a democratic order would mean, but it's wedded to the principle of the world order being supported by a number of senior players, say half dozen major players that form some kind of a concert and jointly rule the world. That's, I think, the Russian. When I say Russian, I mean the Kremlin today, because they are the Russia that matters to the rest of the world in political, geopolitical terms. And this situation is also the result of the failure of integration. In the last 25 years, Russia made a unique attempt to become part of the West, although when it said it wanted to be part of the West, it said at the same breath that it wanted to be part of the West on special terms. And those special terms amounted to being part of the decision-making, which, if you think seriously, meant that they wanted the United States, the only party that mattered, to consult with Russia on all major issues, which was certainly not acceptable to the United States. And I think that was the principal reason for the failure of integration, rather than many other things also matter. Democracy, the state of the Russian market, lots of things, Russian demographic situation, Russian criminal situation, lots and lots and lots and lots of things. But in my view, the most important one was the failure of Russia to accept US leadership, because it's the one country in the world, well, there may be several, but Russia is one of them, whose elite has it in its DNA, a rejection of anyone's leadership, whether it's America's today or whether it's China's tomorrow. And sometimes in their rejection of leadership, they may do things that others will find irrational. But behind this rationality, there is a notion which is deeply seated in the Russian strategic thinking, which is Russia is nothing if not a great power. Russia cannot exist in the world as a state that would find it comfortable to be in its skin, unless it's a great power. Now, what is a great power? I think in the past it was a power that could dictate to others. I think in today's world it's a power that does not allow anyone to dictate to it. And that, I think, is what Russia is after. And it's not going to be easy. The problem of the US-Russian relationship, the fundamental problem, is that Russia cannot get from the United States what it desires. It cannot and will not get this co-equal status that it's trying to get. It will not get the respect of the United States for Russian security interests the way they are defined by the Kremlin. I don't think it will happen. On the other hand, I think that the United States will not get a Russia that they would want to have, a Russia that would be somewhat leaning toward democracy, but most importantly, it would recognize the leadership of the United States in the free world and US leadership over it. So where is Europe in all this? I have to say, with a lot of sadness, that we have mutual alienation at this point. It's less about security and less about the world order, but more about values and worldviews. And I think we have a big gap there. I think the gap is on both sides. I don't think that the Russians today understand Europe, even to the extent that they understood it when Russia was called the Soviet Union. I think we had more serious studies of Europe than we have today. I think we're too focused on just one country, the United States. I think we have been lazy to learn languages and study countries not through the prism of the mainstream global media, but directly. But the good thing is that this alienation is, everything I'm talking about is happening at the political level. It's not happening at other levels. There are no restrictions for normal people to travel, trade, apart from the sanctions. It's an important, of course, restriction, is continuing. We live in an information environment that knows no borders. So what we're talking about is very political, but this is the salient feature of this current confrontation/alienation. If I look into the future, I see uneasy cohabitation between Russia and Europe for the foreseeable future. Again, I'm talking in political terms. So where does this lead us? As Liana said, I try to argue in the book that the Cold War fears, like that of a Russian overland invasion of Poland, the Baltic states, whoever else in NATO, reflect people's memories from the past. They have little to do with current decision-making, current planning in Moscow, or current Russian interests. So I wouldn't, if I were a Baltic person, I would say I should be more concerned about the fact that my nation building presumes that Russians are assimilated within an Estonian nation or a Latvian nation, which I don't think will happen. So there's a fiction of an ethnically based nation out there, which does not allow for Russian speakers to have their own identity within that nation, unlike, let's say, the Swedish population of Finland or the Flemish and Dutch, Flemish and Wallonian populations in Belgium. So I'd be more worried about the internal integration than about aggression from Russia. But there are other things that make me very worried. There's information warfare that's going on, and I alluded to that in my opening remarks when I talked about demonization versus lampoonization. And it's very rare to have these days objective, fact-based, evidence-based analyses in the mainstream media or in the state-run media in Russia. We also live in the environment of economic warfare, at least in several areas. And this warfare is not abating. In fact, it may become more entrenched and it can expand. We just hear that the United States Senate has almost unanimously approved a new wave of sanctions against Russia. And I think that's the way to go. And it doesn't make me very happy, but that's the trend in which things are going. And there's political warfare. And this is what you would call cross-interference in political developments across the border. There's no Iron Curtain. There's not going to be an Iron Curtain. But the Iron Curtain used to protect each of the two blocs from the undue influence of the other. Without that Iron Curtain, you can reach out. You can try to influence in various ways, whether it is through cyber attacks, as we've seen, or through promotion of democracy in authoritarian societies. And that's the environment in which we live. So I'm not worried about premeditated invasions. Not worried about the things I was deeply worried when I wore Soviet military uniform in the divided Germany. I think, actually, in those days, I felt that the world was very static. I didn't think that war was imminent, most of the time at least. There was a period in the 1980s, 1983, 84, when I was a bit concerned about things, but apart from that, I think we saw that situation as pretty static. But right now, we are in a situation in which kinetic collisions between US and Russian forces are more likely than most people, maybe most people in this hall believe. I think you have the closer US aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft came to Russia's borders in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea areas, the closer Russian interceptor warplanes are coming to US planes. And sometimes they come within a few meters. And that's pretty scary. At some point, no one can control these things. Or think of Syria. One of the campaign ideas of Hillary Clinton last year was the imposition of a no-fly zone in Syria. To me, that was an invitation to a shooting match between Russian forces in Syria and US forces in Syria. And as you know, Russia lost a plane to the Turks, but had Russia lost a plane to the Americans, we would be in a very different situation. Russia bombed, in a friendly fire accident, Turkish troops near the town of El Bab in the north of Syria. Had the Russians bombed American troops, even in a friendly fire incident, that would be very big and very dangerous. We're not out of the danger zone now. Suppose the United States adopts the practice of continuous, sustained air bombings of Syrian government forces. The question I have at the back of my mind is whether Russia, maybe at the front of my mind, how Russia will respond to that. Will they simply accept the utter failure of their operation, or will they find a way to respond? We're living in a dangerous world, more dangerous than I think we deserve to live in, because there is no big idea behind it all. There's a competition at a very different level between the dominant power and the power that does not accept that dominance in its own realm. That's what it's all about in a nutshell, in my view. So what do we do about that? The good news, and this is, I promise, this is the last thing I will say by way of introduction, so I won't keep you waiting, because I really look forward to a give and take with you, because I have come here to learn more than to say what I think needs to be said. The good news to those who fear US-Russian collusion in Europe is that there will be no Yalta, no new Yalta. The bad thing for those who are tired of this confrontation and want to get back to normal is that there's not going to be a new Helsinki. I think we'll have to live through a period of adversity in US-Russian, NATO-Russian relations. And it will be a big difference to all of us, whether this adversity is managed or mismanaged. We have to learn to manage it clearly, whether through communications, whether through deeper understanding of where we're coming from, through confidence-building measures, through containing the differences and conflicts that we have today, including in places like Ukraine, to cooperating where cooperation is necessary. And I think that cooperation is necessary in Syria, cooperation is necessary in the wider Middle East against terrorism and extremism, places like Afghanistan, places like Korea. But it will be very difficult, I understand, particularly I think for American friends to accept Russia as a partner in all these things. To be able to, as they say, walk and chew gum. They did it under Clinton. I don't think they will be able to do that now. So you either walk or you chew gum. But I think that societies need to keep an open mind. That's the most important thing. Societies in this part of the world, societies in Russia, societies in the United States, and try to see the reality for what it is, which is very complex. We're being fed, I think, very simplistic narratives. And these narratives potentially could be our undoing. I think we have to be careful to keep an open mind. But let me end on a positive note. My wife and I first came to this country 39 years ago. And we stayed here for 5 years. And we've been coming here ever since. I don't know how many times we've been to Germany. Certainly more than 100 times in the last 25 years. And we've seen the world change. And the things that we see and we enjoy today should never be taken for granted. The world has changed enormously, even despite everything I've just told you. The world has changed enormously and for the better in the last 30 years. And no one could have predicted that. So I think that there will be things, there will be people, there will be ideas that will help us steer away from this collision. When I hear the word collusion in the United States with reference to Trump and Russia, my answer is you should be more concerned about US-Russian collision than about US-Russian collusion. So let me end on that note with this hope for a better future. And let me again thank you, Liana, and the Körber-Stiftung for this great opportunity to address you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dmitri. Before I open the floor for questions from the audience, let me just follow up on one thing you said. You already mentioned cyber attacks. You mentioned what is happening at the moment in the United States. There is a very concrete fear about Russian interference in elections. After the elections in the United States, after the elections in France, where we witnessed a cyber attack. And as you well know, in September, we have our parliamentary elections in Germany. So what would you say to those who fear Russian interference in our German elections? If you share this concern, how can we deal with such threats, and what would be your advice?
Well, first of all, I think that in this new world in which we live, and given the adversity that exists, and given the sanctions regime imposed on Russia, which has put the Kremlin on a war footing, sanctions are a means of warfare. And they're not taken lightly. I would say that a certain measure of interference is to be expected. Again, I have no evidence to point to where interference is coming from, except in the open. When I look at some news channels, some information channels, I see them taking a very clear position, which, since there's no Iron Curtain, could be seen as pushing a certain narrative in a foreign audience. I think you have it in Germany, in Europe. I think you have it in the United States. I think you have it in Russia. I don't think you should be, you should believe that Russia is not coming under attack. Russia is not the only country that possesses cyber weapons. The United States is a serious power. Now, the United States is the United States intelligence and military departments treat Russia as number one threat to the United States, as number one enemy to the United States. And that has consequences. So as a Russian, you are being attacked, you are under threat in different ways. Well, you have to accept this reality. I don't think you can say, well, we don't want that. Okay, you don't want that, guys, but you know, that's the world you live in. But having said all that, again, I cannot point finger to anything that I would be able to consider as a clear case of a cyber attack having come from an established source. And it's a world of smoke and mirrors. And it's not like nuclear, not like missiles. You know where missiles coming from. You don't know where a cyber attack is coming from. But again, having said all that, I would say that I have two takeaways from the United States elites or United States political establishment behavior over the Russian interference, or alleged Russian interference, let's say, in the US election. One is that I see with amazement, I'm stunned to see, even appalled, to see the lack of self-confidence among the US political establishment. I always thought, even when I was a Soviet military officer, that the United States had the most stable political system in the world, that the United States could weather any storm, internal or external, that the United States would always be able to keep its political system safe from any conceivable interference from anyone. And the Soviet Union tried that. The Soviet Union supported black liberation movement against racism in the United States. The Soviet Union supported communists in the United States when there were a few communists in the United States. The Soviet Union supported workers' movement. You know, anything that came that way was immediately used by the Soviet propaganda. And I think it's now being used by the Russian propaganda. When you watch RT, a lot of that is propaganda. And I think it's from the standpoint of the people who run Russia, this is legitimate. Because they see many Western attempts at promoting democracy, supporting color revolutions as Western political interference. They saw Ukraine pre-Maidan, during Maidan, as a case of blatant Western political interference. We can talk about that. I'm only discussing the attitudes in the Kremlin, the attitudes of the people who run Russia and who are behind those things. So the other thing I'm stunned by is the notion that once you're exposed to Russian propaganda, you're immediately converted by the Russian propaganda. That I find to be very Soviet. When Soviet citizens were not allowed, as a matter of rule, to go abroad or to freely listen to Western propaganda or Western news analysis, whatever, Western information. The idea was that if a Soviet citizen were to be allowed on his own, on her own, that Soviet citizen would immediately fall prey to Western intelligence services or to Western propaganda, Western way of life, anything. So the Soviet leadership did not trust the Soviet people. Now I see elements of the United States political establishment not trusting the American people. And I find it very interesting, but very serious, because it tells you that the people whom you thought to be extremely stable, extremely solid, see themselves as very vulnerable. So maybe they're not so solid. Maybe the whole thing is not so stable. And that changes one's view of the world, or at least the most important part in the world. And very lastly, should you fear Russian interference in Germany or France? I think that the evidence that we've had, at least the evidence that I've heard, of Russian interference is very slim. I think there's a loan to Marine Le Pen's party, a couple of million of dollars. Okay. There's an attack on Macron's headquarters. What kind of an attack? Who was behind it? Difficult to say. Anyone can claim he'd been attacked. I think they were attacked, but it's not quite clear to me how big, how important it was. My own thinking is that your country, your democracy, your people are safe. You should have no cause for war. You are a stable democracy. You are a stable polity. You can withstand any attack, even if it came from anywhere. I wouldn't be very worried if I were a German. I don't know. Maybe you have a different view. Then I will change my view of Germany.
Thank you very much, Dmitri. Now you have the opportunity. I've already seen the first person who wants to ask a question. Can we have a microphone over here? Just in the first row to the right. And you can ask a question in German.
Könnten Sie beschreiben, wie Sie die Rolle Deutschlands gegenüber Russland sehen und ob Sie glauben, dass das eine kluge Rolle ist, die wir im Moment spielen?
I would guard against any interference in German politics, so I will not offer judgment on whether it's smart, whether it's clever, or whether it's otherwise. I will say that I'm very saddened and disappointed that what is one of the most important relationships on the continent of Europe between Germany and Russia that was developed at the time of German reunification and then had been going strong for a fairly long period of time, is now broken. A broken relationship. And we have to look for ways to mend that relationship. But not to mend it in a way that, we go back to, pre-Crimea, pre-Ukraine, and, then things will be fine. I don't think you can bracket things. I don't think you can undo things that were done. I don't think you can forget the fundamental things that have happened, because they have happened and they're fundamental. Russia has changed in the last 3 years in terms of its relations with particularly the Western world, but I would say with much of the rest of the world. But I would say Germany needs to play, in my view, and who am I? Germany needs to play a leadership role in Europe, in cooperation with others. I think that Germany has a lot that goes for it, and I think that it is a time for Germany to upgrade its foreign policy to the level of strategy. There was an interesting piece in today's Die Welt, controversial, as I understand, in the German debate. But I think it's vitally important for Germany take the lead to make sure that the difficult relationship with Russia, that is fraught with dangers, is taken under control. I don't think we can fix it for now, but I think we need to bring it under control. And I think that Germany's role needs to be more of a leadership. So I vote for an upgrade for Germany.
Vielen Dank. Die nächste Frage war hier vorne. Und dann würde ich auch noch den Herrn da hinten gleich mit dazu nehmen.
Sie erwähnten mehrfach den Begriff von Weltordnung. Nun impliziert Weltordnung auch Weltherrschaft. Und wenn wir uns die Geschichte ansehen, dann führten mondiale Imperien meistens zur Unfreiheit der Völker. Ist es nicht an der Zeit, dass die USA eine multipolare Welt anerkennen, so wie es Russland auch tut, und China? Vielen Dank.
Und noch in der vorletzten Reihe eine zweite Frage.
Vielen Dank. Meine Frage ging in eine andere Richtung. Und zwar, Sie hatten gerade vorhin erwähnt, dass die deutsche Außenpolitik eine stärkere Rolle übernehmen soll. Das wäre dann ja in gewisser Weise auch eine Gegenüberstellung gegenüber der europäischen Außenpolitik. Und wir sehen ja, dass die Europäische Union eigentlich ihr Sanktionsregime mehr oder weniger unwillens aufrechterhält, während die Vereinigten Staaten hier immer weitergehen. Was meinen Sie, würden möglicherweise die einzelnen Staaten eher dafür plädieren, diese Sanktionsregime aufzuheben, wenn beispielsweise Deutschland eine stärkere Rolle übernehmen würde? Wir hatten es jetzt auch gesehen mit der Nord Stream Pipeline. Die USA gehen immer weiter und gehen so weit, dass es auch für Deutschland möglicherweise negativ sein könnte. Wie sehen Sie das? Vielen Dank.
Okay. Well, I've been talking about the world order, which in my view is distinct from the global order. Global, I think, has many more players. World is still, I think, very much centered on states. I think we are living through a period of the United States exiting the unique period in the history of the world of one power being the dominant all over. And as it often happens in those situations, but before it was always on a regional level, that dominance meant peace, at least peace among major powers. So there was a Pax Americana from the fall of the Berlin Wall to Crimea. Whereas a lot of people focus on the word Americana, and they're talking about the end of Pax Americana as the end of US dominance, I also place emphasis on the word Pax, because during those 25 years there was peace among the major players in the world, which is not available today, certainly not between the United States and Russia, or NATO and Russia. And China is also a disturbing factor if you look at how China is seen from Washington. So I think that the U.S. is going from dominance to preeminence. I think it will be the preeminent power in the world as long as I can see. Certainly in all of my lifetime. As to multipolarity, I don't think it's a very useful concept, frankly. I think that there will be several players of different size, different importance, but they will not be co-equal. There will be some kind of hierarchy out there. There will be relations among those poles will actually be rough sometimes. And even relations between non-Western poles, say China and India, that relationship is difficult. And to me, any period of change in the world order historically is a very dangerous moment. Normally, the change of world order was done through a war. It's the first time, and if you accept that the Cold War was also a war, then that includes the Cold War. But for the first time, this change is happening in a relatively peaceful way. And I hope that it will continue to happen in a relatively peaceful way. But but we should have no illusion that the change of world order is a peaceful thing. It's essentially a very adversarial thing. It's a very dangerous thing. So we're living, as our Chinese friends are saying, we're living in interesting times, ladies and gentlemen. So congratulations. With regard to sanctions, I think I may be a pessimist. But to me, sanctions are for a very long time. And I don't think that the United States will ease sanctions. It's actually making them tougher. And moreover, Russia doesn't have to do anything bad in order for the sanctions to be ratcheted up. If Russia just continues where it is today, the sanctions will get tougher. Now, if they get tougher in the United States, an interesting question is, will Europe follow? And this is an issue of Atlantic solidarity. Again, my expectation, as someone who sits in Moscow, is that despite all the concerns that have recently been expressed again, Europe is more likely to follow than to allow decoupling between itself and the United States. So I would expect more sanctions, and I would expect that situation to continue. My time horizon is 10 years. And this includes the next presidency of Vladimir Putin. And then we don't know what happens then. But there may be a different situation, which could either make things better or make things worse. And we don't know yet.
Thank you. 2 more questions here, and then.
Yes, hello, thanks. What do you think about the ongoing debate in Germany by politicians on a German or European nuclear force? Second, what about the modernization of theater nuclear forces for Western Europe, and on the other side, the deployment of Iskander missiles by Russia? The third is, do you see any violation of the INF Treaty by Russia? So that INF Treaty was dealing about Pershing and cruise missiles in '83, and that's my last question. What was so different in '83?
A set of questions. We take one more by the gentleman in the middle with the blue shirt. Oh, you want to hear that answer first? Then we wait and we give you the opportunity to respond.
Well, I would be worried about the nuclearization of the European security debate. I think we are going back to, in some ways, to the past, to the years of the Cold War, in terms of increasing the level of militarization of our confrontation. So far, as I said, it's more political, it's partially economic. The most hotly debated field, or the most active battlefield, is that of information warfare, and that would include cyber. But military so far has been has been more of a laggard. What I fear is that, what I'm concerned about is that we're maybe going in the direction of militarization of this confrontation in Europe. And that would be dangerous, in my view. I think that the issue of German nuclear forces would be, for the reasons that you know very well, would be an extremely allergic issue. Not only here, not only Moscow, I mean, but also I think of the United States. Because basically a country that possesses nuclear weapons has the kind of an autonomy in global politics that other countries don't have. If you have nuclear, you don't need allies. Nuclear is your ally. I don't think that a lot of people would in the United States would support that. In Russia, of course, there are memories and, that better not evoked. With regard to the modernization of tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe, I think we need to be clear about the scale and scope of that modernization. Those weapons exist. Nuclear weapons need to be modernized, otherwise they become more dangerous. If you don't modernize a weapon that's been there for decades and decades and decades and decades, you don't know whether they will be not only militarily effective, but whether they will be safe to handle at some point. You need to go through modernization phases. I'm not inherently an anti-nuclear guy, having served in the military for 21 years. I think that the military, I think that nuclear has scared us so much that it, more than anything else, has prevented us from World War III. That's a debatable proposition, I think, to many of you, but that's how I feel. Iskander I see as an issue that is linked to the regional strategic situation in Europe that includes ballistic missile defense deployments by the United States. That includes a new posture of NATO vis-à-vis Russia. That I think cannot be singled out. What I think can be singled out is the INF issue. If the United States and Russia had a civil relationship, they don't have to be friends. They don't have to like each other. But if they had a minimally normal relationship, like the Soviet Union and the United States in the 1970s, they would sit down and discuss American concerns vis-à-vis Russian concerns, American concerns vis-à-vis the Russian cruise missiles, Russian concerns vis-à-vis the potential conversion of the launch sites of U.S. Missile defenses in Europe. But we're running a very high temperature in the relationship. Moreover, we don't have yet an administration in Washington. The United States is going through a political warfare of its own, in which Russia is a political football. It's not about Russia, the story about collusion. The story about collusion is about toppling Donald Trump, in my view, getting him out. And Russia is an instrument for that, or the Russia links is an instrument of that. So it's a very difficult moment. We never faced anything like that in the United States. This kind of political warfare, this kind of a crisis that the United States is going through. I think you have to go very long back in time to find a similarly precarious moment in American domestic politics. Certainly Nixon is no comparison. And the thing is not over. And the thing is not only about Washington, D.C., it's about the country. 83. In 83, I think the Soviet leadership under Yuri Andropov came to the conclusion that the United States was preparing a first decapitating nuclear strike. That was the official conclusion of the Soviet leadership. All right, and Soviet intelligence services were directed to watch around the world anything that might point to the United States getting ready to strike first. They would stay up all night to watch the Pentagon and see how many windows were had light at night, and where those windows were, and what that could have meant. And as you understand, in this very nervous situation, bad things could have happened. We also know that there were a few near misses in the Cold War when someone mistook a flight of birds for an incoming missile. And the idea was, do you push the button, do you not? It's very scary. So I hope we don't have to go through that again. But '83 was a very, very dangerous moment. And that was, of course, against the background of the deployment of the Euro missiles in your country, other countries in Europe, and the continued deployment of Russian INF missiles, again in your country, and in other countries of the Eastern Bloc.
Thank you. So we had 2 questions in the left block, and then we moved to the middle.
Sir, you said you don't believe in cyber attacking the United States. I
didn't say that. I didn't say that.
Well, yeah, I haven't finished yet. Sorry.
Let me make myself clear. The United States is under cyber attack.
Is.
And Russia is under cyber attack. A lot of other countries are under cyber attack.
But what matters at the moment is America. And if you say the Russians didn't attack,
that would
mean that Mr. Trump is innocent, which is hard to believe.
I take no judgment on Mr. Trump.
So
he is a president of the United States, according to the Constitution of the United States. And to me, he's the president. And I'm not an American, so I do not feel this way or that way about Mr. Trump. And as a foreigner, again, I respect the will of the American people. Had they elected Hillary Clinton, I would have respected Hillary Clinton as president of the United States.
All right. And the second question is that in 1989, I guess, between Gorbachev and Reagan, that was going quite well. And then was peace till Putin took the Crimea. Now, what changed there, and what does Putin want with the Crimea, and what does he want with the Ukraine?
Okay, that's a good question. So let me, yeah.
You answer this question first, and then we take the lady in the.
I think '89 was a very good year, particularly for Germany. It was a pretty bad year for the Soviet Union, even as things were getting well on the international scene, and good things were done in Russian-Western relations, Soviet-Western relations. Things within the Soviet Union were getting out of control. The Soviet Union was moving toward a civil war. And the Soviet Union did collapse, as we all know, within a couple of years. And hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives as a result. When Vladimir Putin talked about the collapse of the Soviet Union as a major catastrophe, major geopolitical catastrophe of the 21st century. By the way, he didn't say the major, because in Russian you can say things without meaning that this is the most. It's one of the most important things. What he actually meant was the collapse of so many things simultaneously in the Soviet Union. For example, my tutor was a leading Russian Americanologist, right? And he was, he was drawing a pretty decent salary in the Soviet Union. So his salary at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union was equal to $6 American a month. And this happened to everyone else in the Soviet Union at that time. It's difficult for you to imagine, I would imagine, the kind of shock that the people in the Soviet Union experienced as their country collapsed. It's one thing to have your country divided, and I appreciate that. When I was a Soviet officer in Germany, and I often visited West Berlin, I often thought, not every time, but very often thought how I would feel if Moscow were divided into 4 sectors, the biggest one belonging to the Chinese, and and Russia itself were divided, St. Petersburg being an alternative capital, or Nizhny Novgorod. So I know what I'm talking about. But you also need to appreciate the kind of misery that the Soviet people went into immediately, even as the Cold War was ending. A lot of people were cheering in the rest of the world. In the Soviet Union, things were very different. So things worked quite well, but not quite. That reminds me of a story. I will not tell you a story. It's beside the point, just to save time. What happened between them and Crimea? Several things. Yeltsin, and then Putin, and then Medvedev essentially asked for Russian membership in NATO. They were spurned each time. Yeltsin also asked for a military alliance with the United States. He was told, it's no longer time for alliances, Mr. Yeltsin. We're out of the Cold War. Of course we'll preserve NATO, but you sit where you are. You'll be fine. A very important thing that happened to the Russian strategic community and the political community was Kosovo. You may not appreciate it, but the idea was that the United States was no longer bound by anything. International law ceased to exist. It was the United States who decided what was international law, what was not international law, how international law could be adjusted, changed, adopted, readopted, adapted. And Russia didn't have to bother. It was not so much about Serbia, because they immediately made the link between Kosovo and Chechnya. And basically the decision was that the only thing that prevented us from an American interference, military interference in Russia, in Chechnya, was Russian nuclear weapons. And Mr. Yeltsin, who in 1992 offered to Mr. Bush, the senior, a Russian alliance with the United States, said a few weeks before his resignation in a public address to Bill Clinton from China, of all places, that Mr. Clinton should not forget for 1 minute, for 1 second, that Russia was a nuclear power. 2001, Putin, having swallowed Kosovo, extends his arm to the United States and NATO again. That arm is not, there's no response to that. Basically, they're told, the Russians, that you'll have partnership and that's fine. You will not be partners. And then, of course, the United States was diverted to Iraq, which was another big wake-up call to the Russians. And then many other things happened. So Mr. Putin, who started in 2001 with pledging Russian alliance with the United States in the war against terror, and even acknowledging US primacy in that alliance, ended his first 2 terms with a speech in your country, in Munich, where he fulminated against American dominance, hegemony in the world. That's what's happened. And then there was a 3rd attempt. Then Mr. Medvedev, of course, under Putin, proposing to NATO in 2010 what they called a common defense perimeter based on joint missile defenses. Joint missile defense would have been a fine thing, great thing. It would have meant NATO-type alliance without the constraints of being formally member of an alliance. That would have been a very elegant way of what I would call, for lack of a good English word, a Burgfrieden between Russia and the West. But this also was essentially rejected. And I don't think that it was rejected out of stupidity. I thought it was stupidity or lack of foresight, whatever. I used to blame the West for that, the United States, for many years. But I kept thinking, and my current thinking tells me that the United States was actually very farsighted in rejecting Russia as an ally. Because if the most important thing to you is your global leadership, then you would not want to have Russia within your tent. Because Russia might sit tight. Russia is different from, well, if I may say with all due respect, from Germany, France, Britain, Japan, and many other very important allies of the United States, who are in many ways more powerful economically than Russia. Now, Russia is different in the sense that, as I said, it would sit tight for a couple of years. And then on the third year, fourth year, it would start claiming its right to co-decide with the United States. And then it would look for allies. Maybe your country, maybe France, maybe Italy, maybe all of them together. And then what would have been left of NATO? So I think that the United States did everything right in order to protect its leadership in the Western world by rejecting Russia from this Western world. Again, because of the DNA that exists in the Russian political class. I'm very critical of the Russian establishment. I think they are the worst ever that we had as a nation. Corrupt and self-centered and, can talk hours about their failures. But there's one thing that they have, which is, in my view, difficult to extinguish, is this rejection of anyone's leadership over them. And that, I think, prevented it. Have I answered your question? I don't know.
I think let's try to collect a couple of other questions. I think there have been many hands up. The lady in the back has been waiting for quite a while. Then we take a question here, and we had another question over there.
Ja, schönen guten Abend. Ich würde da gerne anschließen und ein bisschen mehr auf die wirtschaftlichen Faktoren zu sprechen kommen. Und zwar, mein Eindruck ist, Sie sagten, dass die USA immer noch sehr dominant ist, was zweifelsohne richtig ist. Aber mein Eindruck ist eher, dass die USA, the American way of life, bröckelt und in sich zerfällt. Und was da im Moment passiert in den Staaten, ist ja wirklich gruselig. Und die Frage wäre jetzt aus russischer Sicht, wäre es nicht gut, ich weiß nicht, wie Sie das einschätzen, auch die Handelsbeziehungen und man weiß ja, dass aus der Geschichte, wenn die Leute nicht genug zu essen haben und eben nicht das, was sie als Wohlstand empfinden, dann gibt es immer Unruhen. Und wäre es nicht geschickt von den Menschen im Kreml gerade die Nähe zu Europa zu suchen und insbesondere natürlich auch zu Deutschland und zu Frankreich, um dann vielleicht doch gemeinsam für uns Europäerinnen und Europäer wäre es vielleicht ja auch eine Chance, uns ein wenig zu emanzipieren von der amerikanischen Nachkriegsdominanz. Das wäre so meine Frage, wie Sie das einschätzen.
Well, first of all, I will not, again, not give my judgment on whether Europe should free itself from US dominance or not. I think it's a sensitive issue, and it's not for me as a Russian to give you advice on all these things. I think that the United States, as I said, is going through a very difficult crisis like has not seen in many, many, many decades. And this crisis, in my view, will change America. And it's not about what's happening within the Beltway. It's the entire country. It will not be decided within the Beltway only. I think that the Russians should pay more attention to Europe, and I said in my earlier remarks that I very much deplore the lack of interest in Europe, or the Russian predilection these days, very short-sighted and very stupid, frankly, to dismiss Europe to dismiss the Europeans, call them vassals of the United States, and things are more complex than that. So I wish that we had more in Russia, that we had some kind of a strategy toward Europe, and we don't have it yet. I hope we will come up with it, but it'll take some time. But I fully accept and agree with you, accept your point and agree with you that Russia needs to do much more with Europe, even though there's serious differences, there's a conflict, there's a mismatch of worldviews. There are many things that we should not vertuschen. However, we should be focusing clearly on relations. And there, Germany, in my view, should play the leading role. I'm sorry for jumping in.
Perfect. Let's take one question here and then another one over there.
Wir haben ja bis jetzt hauptsächlich über Mächte gesprochen. Ich möchte mal eine ganz andere Facette ansprechen. Ich habe das dumme Gefühl, dass in den letzten Jahren oder Jahrzehnten immer mehr extreme Persönlichkeiten die Weltgeschäfte bestimmen. Ahmadinejad im Iran, Rouhani, Trump nicht vergessen. Immer stärker extreme Persönlichkeiten. Jetzt komme ich auf Russland. Wir schätzen hier Herrn Putin als, ich sage mal, als gefährlichen Menschen ein, KGB, verschlagen und so weiter. Würde man einem Herrn Medvedev wahrscheinlich nicht zutrauen. So sieht es in Amerika aus, Trump versus Clinton oder wem auch immer. Aber ich habe das Gefühl, in den letzten Jahren sind immer mehr extreme Persönlichkeiten entscheidend für die Weltpolitik geworden. Wie sehen Sie das in Russland, gerade bei Putin? Ist er ein gefährlicher Mann oder verteidigt er nur sein Land oder seine Interessen? Wie würde es dann mit einem Medvedev ausgehen?
Und noch eine Frage. Der Herr da hinten hatte sich schon länger gemeldet.
Ich möchte einmal ganz kurz nur darstellen, wie viele hier in Deutschland die politische Situation im Moment sehen. Uns brechen die Partner weg. Uns bricht die Türkei weg. Mit den USA wird es schwieriger. England bricht uns weg. Frankreich hat es gerade noch geschafft nach der Wahl. Deshalb sagt auch zum Beispiel Frau Merkel, was man lange nicht von ihr gehört hat, dass Russland wieder als Partner irgendwie auf den Tisch kommt. Das hat sie jetzt bei einem der letzten Summits gesagt. Wenn wir Partner haben wollen, dann müssen diese Partner verlässlich sein. Verlässlich können sie nur dann sein, wenn wir die Kräfte in dem Land auch kennen. Balance of Power, wie es in den USA hoffentlich funktioniert. Wir werden sehen. Wie ist das in Russland? Können Sie uns einen Überblick geben über die verschiedenen Kräfte, die wirken? Von uns sehen wir eigentlich immer nur Putin, der Kreml als einzige Kraft. Welche verschiedenen Kräfte gibt es? Welche Rolle spielt das Militär? Sie als 21 Jahre lange gedienter Soldat, Offizier. Ja, können Sie da einen Überblick geben?
Okay.
Und vielleicht, Dmitri, weil wir nicht mehr viel Zeit haben, möchtest du vielleicht noch kurz etwas sagen zu den Protesten, die kürzlich stattgefunden haben in Russland, in Moskau, in all den anderen Städten, wie man diese einordnen muss?
I think I have a different concern. I'm less concerned about extremists in power. I think there's more labeling of people as extremists or irrational than there's extremism or irrationality. My concern is I think, the opposite. Around the world, particularly in the Western world, but not only, we have very complacent elites who've had it very good in the last 25 years. They were liberated from the responsibility of having to fight a Cold War. They've been liberated financially to become as rich as they could. They've been liberated by the end of communism and the end of an alternative to the existing order, so that all parties are more or less, at least to, you know, a naive outsider like myself, they all look very much the same in the West, whether it's Europe or the United States. And there's a clear deficit of leadership. You look at the leaders of today, in many countries, they're more like followers than leaders. They follow the ratings. You know, they are just like people working at some global exchange, and they look at the shares going up, going down, and they react to that, which I don't think is a good way of leading people. I also think that quite a few things were decided among the elites and not properly consulted with the people. So there's something that, and I would link this question to the next one. I think there's a normal thing, what I would call a crisis of democracy, which is normal and good, because democracy is not something that is one and only, that's once and forever. The democracy that was started in the United States at the end of the 18th century was very, in today's world, would be, you know, slave owners and women not being able to vote until the 20th century, many things. It will not be recognized as democracy. The democracy in Europe before 1968 was very different from the democracy of post-1968. So I think that the elites have focused too much on themselves and too little on their leadership role in societies and countries. And I think that they're paying the price for that. And the price comes in the form of fringe movements, anti-systemic or asystemic movements, whether it's in France, whether it's in your country, whether it's in some other countries, whether it's in the United States. Sometimes people whom Putin called colorful personalities emerge as leaders of those counter movements. To me, this is a wake-up call. And I hope that this wake-up call is heeded by the responsible elites in your countries. Again, make no mistake, I judge my own elite as the worst that we've had in our entire history. They're all focused on themselves. The Soviet elite still worked for the state. The imperial elite still worked for the Tsar. These guys work for themselves and for themselves only. I think it's extremely unhealthy. Mr. Putin and the KGB, I don't think that Mr. Putin is a dangerous man because he's a KGB man. I think that the KGB, as all other intelligence services around the world, is a fairly disciplined organization. And normally people who have emerged from the services, as those who have emerged from the military, by the way, the bulk of them, are more responsible than others, in my view, in my very limited experience. So he is, I think he has become more of a, how shall I put it? He has been singled out as a problem. When I read German newspapers, they often, instead of saying Russia, they say Putin, which means that they separate Putin from Russia, which from their standpoint may be a very good and very kind thing to do, because the idea is that Russia is essentially good, but Putin is essentially bad. My own analysis of Vladimir Putin is that he's been able to stay in power in Russia for 17 years, and he will stay in power for some more time, because he is Russia's Putin, and that makes Russia Putin's Russia. But it's Russia's Putin before it becomes Putin's Russia. In other words, in the Russian system, which is authoritarian, and I will not try to portray it as something else, and I would call Russia a monarchy, which reminds me of the first article of the Weimar Constitution. I would only reverse it. You would recall that the first article of the Weimar Constitution says that das Deutsche Reich ist eine Republik. In Russian, the word Reich is translated as an empire, which makes it a bit funny. So the Russian Federation is a monarchy. That should have been the first article of the real Russian Constitution, right? But having said all that, he is there not because of coercion, although there is a fair amount of coercion. Not because because he has been able to lie with impunity to the Russian people and misled them. He is genuinely seen by the bulk of the Russian people, and that bulk may be 3/4 of the Russian people, as their champion. As the champion, first of all, vis-à-vis the elites, who do not have a high standing in the eyes of the Russian people. So he is a good czar versus bad boyars. But he is also someone who can stay in touch with the people through television and elsewhere. He's seen as a czar who cares, or as the only person in the land which speaks very badly about the land, who can fix things. No one else can, from your plumbing to your constitution. Again, this says something about society, right? But society, I talked about the misery of the 1990s. It looks like a very long time ago. Russia has never had it so good as now. You have a country which has never had that high level of well-being and that high level of personal freedom. Never, ever in its entire history. A lot of that happened on Putin's watch. And Russia was provided stability. We lived, my wife and I, for 10 years, we lived through the 90s, we lived with the thought of a civil war breaking out in Russia at the back of our minds. This is a very uneasy feeling. A few million people left Russia in that period. Some because of the opportunities, others out of fear. You don't have it now. You think that you have a fair amount of stability, even though the situation today economic situation is not very cheerful. Now, very, very quickly, on Russian-German partnership. I hope there will be partnership at some point. I don't see it today. To be very honest, I don't think that Russia and Germany are partners. I think it's right for Mrs. Merkel to talk about Russia as a partner, because that establishes a goal, that establishes her vision, and I think that she is right. But we need to work very hard to make the relationship normal, to allow us to understand one another better. I think, I said that in Russia there is a lack of understanding of modern Europe, including Germany. And my exhibit A, in this sense, is Mr. Putin's claim, public claim, after the incorporation of Crimea into Russia, that the German people would understand us, because that was a reunification of Russians in Crimea and Russians in the rest of Russia. And this is, and he felt it was genuine, it was a huge mistake analytically. But that was how Putin thought the Germans would feel, right? Because there was, you know, if you watch the videos of Crimea in 2014, there was a lot of cheer. There was a lot of jubilation and all that. And Putin compared that to the, you know, German rapprochement and when the wall was pierced in '89. So I think we need to work very hard to understand each other, where we're coming from. We have different views on the same things. You say that Russia broke the rules in 2014. I think you're right. But Russia broke the rules after the rules had been broken in the Russian thinking in 1999, right? I don't think that the Kosovars should, if they don't want to live under Serbian rule, should live under Serbian rule. I think I'm with the Kosovars on that. But I'm also with the others. And, you know, you cannot simply believe that since you are the rule maker, everyone else should follow the rules that you make or you change. That's not going to happen. And very lastly, there are different forces in Russia. Of course there are different forces. There is politics in Russia, but it's very different. I would use the expression of Winston Churchill. He compared Russian politics, domestic politics, to the fight of bulldogs under the carpet. And I think the difference between a democracy and an autocracy is that in a democracy, the bulldogs are on the carpet. In an autocracy, they're under the carpet. That's one big difference. So there are forces. As they used to say that there are many towers in the Kremlin and each tower has its own interests and all that. I think it's right, but there's also the towering tower, which is called Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin's job description actually has 2 points, extremely important for the stability of Russia. He has to do, and that not only applies to Putin, that applies to anyone who steps into his shoes, whenever that happens. That person needs to procure stability for the country through his personal link to the bulk of the Russian people. I would say in order to rule Russia, you need to have at least 60% of public support. If you have 70, you're comfortable. If you have 80, you're glorious, just like Putin is today. But beware when you're down to 50. When you have 51 versus 49, this is civil war in Russia. If Russia were in a position of the United States today, would be in a civil war situation. Okay? But the other part of the job description is for the president to be able to discipline those sharks, hyenas, snakes, and other nice animals who make up an important part of the Russian elite. You have to arbitrate among people who are very tough, and you have to prevail. And Mr. Putin has been able to do that. And it was not an easy thing to do. It was not a safe thing to do at the beginning, or even now. The protests in Russia. Yeah, we could talk about some other things, but we don't have time. The protests in Russia are important and interesting for several reasons. There is, as I said, there's politics even in authoritarian societies. Russia's authoritarian system calls for a periodic confirmation of the top figures in power by the Russian people. And that confirmation is a real thing. Russian people do not change their rulers through the ballot box, but they always ratify the decision of the elites. They may withdraw their ratification. And then, if that happens, and that happened twice in the last 30 years, the country can go down the drain. That happened to Gorbachev. That nearly happened to Yeltsin. So the election is an important thing. Even though Mr. Putin is likely to run And if he runs, he is likely to win. The issue is, what is the percentage point? The Kremlin, as I understand, has put the goal of 70% participation and 70% vote for Mr. Putin. We'll see whether they get that. The protests show that, I think the most important thing that they have shown is that there is a person who clearly wants to be Russia's new leader, call it new Tsar. And he is in the process of building a political army that will help him along the road to that. The emergence of Navalny, not so much Navalny as a person, but Navalny's army, which he took this last Sunday through a very important test. The test was not holding a demonstration. That was the test passed a long time ago. This time he, as you may know, may or may not know, has changed the venue for the demonstration unilaterally and brought his supporters to the place where they were not supposed to be in central Moscow. And that brought them into contact with the law enforcement agencies. So he basically led that army to a confrontation, so far peaceful, but a confrontation with the police. And many of his supporters followed that. So they passed the test. And many of them don't care that they will be detained or otherwise, will be blacklisted or anything. That is interesting. I think his strategy is to get the Kremlin, put him on the ballot list in the election. And that's his strategy. Whether he achieves it or not I'm more skeptical, but I think we should be looking at more confrontations down the road, maybe clashes, and then there can be untoward incidents, unfortunately, and all that. So it's getting serious, but it's just one part of the scene. I wouldn't exaggerate the scope or the strength of that part of the opposition, but it's interesting that Navalny is putting his army through a test. That army is, to a large extent, consists of younger people. So that's my takeaway. There are many other things, but we don't have the time to discuss them all.
The presidential elections will take place in March 2018. We will have a lot of time to continue the discussion on Russia's place in Europe, on Russia's internal development. But for now, for this evening, I think this was a really, truly fascinating and insightful discussion. So I want to thank you, Dmitri, very cordially for being here with us, for being in Hamburg, and for having this conversation.
Thank you, Liana. Thank you all. Vielen Dank.
Liebes Publikum, wenn Ihr Interesse geweckt ist, Sie können am Ausgang finden Sie das Buch von Herrn Trenin. Wenden Sie sich an unsere Kolleginnen, sie helfen Ihnen gerne weiter. Und jetzt darf ich Sie ganz herzlich einladen zu einem Empfang, wo Sie gerne auch noch Fragen, die noch nicht beantwortet werden konnten, mit Herrn Trenin diskutieren können. Ich danke Ihnen, bis zum nächsten Mal im KörberForum und einen schönen Abend noch.
Thank you,
Thank you again.